Kia ora to our audience in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and our global audience joining us for our Decolonizing Anti-Racist Interventions series. It's a real pleasure for us today to have with us the Indigenous activist and rights protector Marise Lant. Marise Lant, kia ora. Marise Lant is a Maori leader, a lobbyist, and someone who has struggled in the front lines for Indigenous rights. Last year, Marise led the 250 years of colonization protest in opposition to the arrival of the replica of the Endeavour to Gisborne on 8th October 2019. As I have conversed with Marise, one of the things I've been so really touched by is the way in which she engages with the question of decolonization across the various protest movements and activist spaces that she has participated in. She's been involved in many Indigenous rights kaupapa, which she will shed some light on in our conversation today. Welcome, Marise.
Kia ora, Mohan. Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi atu ki a koutou.
Kia ora. Marise, I wanted to begin by asking you a little bit about your whānau and how that has influenced the activist work that you do today.
Well, I was raised in a big whānau, big family, in a community where, in Tairāwhiti in Gisborne, where for my whānau in particular, being raised at our marae was important. Engaging and having input into kaupapa Māori-led initiatives was a stepping stone forward to bring us out of the struggles we were going to be facing during that time. And I'm talking back in the 70s and 80s, because I'm only a young spring chicken. But at that time, even growing up, in that era, we were still facing the stereotypes, the labelling that was occurring in our schools. I would be one of those children that was asked, well, if you're Māori or if you're Pākehā, non-Māori, you need to identify one or two of those categories, but nothing else. And coming from a history of whakapapa for me, I've also got a Irish history as well. And so right there and then, growing up, you are being conditioned to fall into a category. And that is a racist conditioning. So for me, at that age, being asked that, and no doubt also others that grew up in that era, it became normalised and it became acceptable. What didn't become acceptable was being told that you're not gonna amount to anything more because Māori are only better as labourers. They're not going to be great achievers or decision makers. I also grew up where my father, who was at that time working at the freezing works in the meat factory, my mother working as a labourer, as a cannery person in Watties. So they worked really hard to keep food on the table. They became that era, or were from that era, where the Tohunga Suppression Act came in, which stopped Māori from practising their, what we considered to be our rongoa Māori. They also came from that area where the reo, they were asked never to speak the reo in their schools. So raising us up with those ideologies became clear that they thought it was going to be better to withdraw us from the culture to keep us safe. And that's important to note. It was about keeping us safe, not necessarily about accepting what was being indoctrinated within institutions and within organisations. And that was a part of the assimilation and oppression process of a colonised structure and Westminster model. It continued when the arrival of the Endeavour came, and it's still here today, very much alive and well. So there's a lot of history for us. My father, being that labourer at the freezing works, we had the protest in the Springboks, when the Springboks first visited here. I was about 8, and my father was the breadwinner that brought the food home. My mother was the homemaker who looked after the children and had to go out and work and help him put the food on the table if there wasn't enough. This particular time when they had the Springboks tour circulating, my father took a stance to go down there and leave his job alongside many other husbands, brothers, uncles, and go down to Barry Park and address what was happening with the South African rugby team. And that was my very first eye-opener into protesting against racism. And I never forgot that, because as a result of him going down and supporting that, returning back to his work, they were not reinstated. And many Maori lost their jobs that attended. So that was significant in my life and in my growing up, because having such a big family, then you looked at where were you going to get the food to put on the table. Our struggles increased because my father took a stance. And because of that stance, many other families were in the same position. So poverty, unemployment, and reliance on what was considered back then the government's benefits was what was left behind. And so we survived going out, working in the fields. I was with my family, big family, 8 years old. We would have to go out, and our parents would get us up 5 o'clock in the morning to go out and work in the tomato fields to keep the family going. So I come from an area in a whānau that knows what it's like to struggle, that knows to be privileged enough not to have to go through that because of the constructs and the racism that's been in place. It's very important for us to revisit that, and it became very important to me.
It seems, thank you for sharing this story. It is so powerful because it also hits home a point. It seems that to speak against racism and colonization is dangerous.
Well, when you are opposing a colonizer, for whatever reason it might be, because you have a passion for what you believe is just and what is right, you must be open to the backlash that's going to come with that. What does that look like? How will you deal with it? And how are you going to protect not only yourself, your people, but also your whānau? And in doing so, whether you're ready to commit to your benefits, or whatever benefits they may be considered to look like or be viewed as, whether you want to lose those or not, because there is a string that's attached to almost everything when we talk about we're opposing or in opposition to colonisation. We found it struggles just through the protest on the 250. There were purposely built walls and barriers that we had to overcome that should never have been there. We had little resources, which is normally what happens when you take on protests. You are really reliant on the passion of the people and the understanding and the information sharing that you all collectively are able to share with one another. It's a tight kaupapa when you're in activism. You must ensure that the people you surround yourself with are people you can trust. They've got your back. a lot of that's got to deal with, sharing the same outcries is very important. Having people that are informed, well educated in terms of what's happening at grassroots. Researching is important. Getting the right research, talking to your communities, talking to your hapu, your whānau, and being engaged and involved in advocating. It's very important that you know what's happening at grassroots. If you are involved with an advocate group that understands the struggles that not just Māori are having, but everybody's having. The reason why Māori tend to be at the forefront is because ko au te whenua, ko te whenua ko au. Our whakapapa is entrenched here. Our whakapapa takes us to the whenua, it takes us all the way up through the matariki concept that we all now are looking at accepting. It took a long time, it should never have, but we've had struggles all the way and will continue to have those struggles unless we make changes. And that change needs to start with the colonial structures that are in place. Take on board what Māori say. Don't say what you think Māori should be saying.
But the colonial structure wouldn't be invested in making the change by itself, would it?
Well, it's not designed. It's certainly not designed for non-Māori to be successful at the top, because we will find in almost every structure that's been constituted, other than through an iwi construct that was brought into place, that there is Māori representation, fair Māori representation. And I want to mention right now, we're going through a lot of the local authorities in terms of Māori representation on there. My whakaaro in terms of that is that when you have local authorities like councils, you do not want to be a tick box exercise Māori. We're not there to fill your seat. We should be there to represent our views as Māori in line with our tikanga and our kaua. More so of te ao Māori. Our te ao Māori worldviews are important. They are what sustain the environment. They are what continue to ensure that our rights are maintained and acknowledged.
So this concept of being a tick box Maori is really interesting, because I also see this within the context of decolonizing and post-colonial struggles in other parts of the world, which is that a small elite group of indigenous people or post-colonial people are often co-opted to be the tick box. So I guess, one of my questions to begin with is, what makes someone a tick box decolonized person?
Well, in my view, they come in all shapes and sizes and colours. And I guess it comes down to institutionalised and disconnected from your grassroots. It also comes back to, how effective are you in helping your people? How have you helped your people? What will you do to effect their change? What does it look like in your through your lens? How do we address the issues that we are facing right now? We are facing decolonisation, and we're wanting to do the decolonisation, but we tend to have the blockages that come up and barriers that come up, and you're right, it happens across the world globally, that we will take a few seeds within each region or each country, and they will be the advisors to the coloniser. We will exclude everyone else outside that circle, and that happens even here in Aotearoa. It happened as it's a strategy that's continued to be used, and Indigenous people need to be aware of that if they're not. ethnic people need to understand that, especially those groups that have been colonised. The strategy hasn't changed. It's always been there. The problem is we need to be sharing the solutions more widely and more openly, and be open to letting our own barriers down.
There are two questions that come out of this conversation. One is, I want to begin by asking that it seems that institutionalization itself plays a role in colonizing us. So part of the challenge then that you're offering us is that we have to decolonize ourselves if we want to participate in the decolonizing project.
We have to decolonise ourselves by understanding that in order to dismantle what's happening in the colonised world, we need to understand how it actually works and functions, which sometimes requires us as a people to actually go inside and find out the internal mechanics so that we know what we want that structure to look like, whether we even want to be a part of it, and how we plan to address it. You cannot dismantle from the outside if you don't know how it's operating and functioning on the inside. We can offer recommendations and suggestions, but the reality of it is that we are going to have to look at revolution. Are we ready for that? Would we prepare to take that on board? Do we have the resources? Do we have the passion to carry it out? What I'm seeing more predominantly now is that our people are finding different approaches and different strategies to deal with it. Very seldomly now are we starting to get out there and protest as much as we used to. And that's okay, because really what that does is raise awareness. But we can't be complacent just with that action. We must continue the action of addressing it through a political avenue and addressing it through the three arms of government, because that's where it starts from. We also must be very clear that we need to understand who's teaching our children, what are they teaching our children, how will that impact on Indigenous people, Maori in particular, here in Aotearoa. Is the person that's teaching our children teaching them a narrative that is going to affect change to, in particular, have an effect on racism? The biggest issue we've had is that we've allowed it to drag on too long without asking the right questions and questioning the right people. Mm. Institutions, and I'll use this as an example, institutions that are governed under the umbrella of a colonised construct like government are always going to have to toe the mark. As Indigenous people and as Maori, we need to be clear about how much input we want into that. Who will we build our relationships with? Do we need the government to be our third party trade person? Do I need him to tell me or her to be telling me as mana whenua that I want to do business with you? Is that necessary? All of these things are what we need to be looking at in a contemporary colonised worldview. And how do we decolonise those thoughts?
So part of this, what you're saying is that we also have to go into the inside of the colonial structure to understand it and to study it. The challenge, I think, and I reflect on my own education, and I think that the challenge is that once you go in, there are so many rewards that are put in place to accommodating, where the lesson is that if I adapt myself to the structure, I will have these benefits. So I guess, how does one stay aware of that, reflect on that, and challenge that?
When you put yourself into an environment that is very tempting in terms of whether you remain pono to the kaupapa or staunch to your kaupapa, make sure you're not going in there alone. make sure you're communicating with people of the same and a like mind, so you are consistently reminded of why you're there. And be very clear that you have your objective and your goal. It's all about the survival, the revival, the reconnection, and the retention of not only your whenua but also your people. If you hold fast to those things, there is very little that will change your views. And it's important that we do that. It's important that we collaborate with our Indigenous people and our ethnic groups, because we have very similar history in terms of colonisation, the way our people have been colonised, the strategies that have been used, the lands that have been confiscated, the activities that have gone out around the world globally in terms of oil and gas industry practices, big corporatised developments, confiscation of land, sale of land, the environmental impacts. We are hearing strong around the world about climate change. But who's actually leading that cry? Is it Indigenous people? Is it ethnic people? Is it those that have been colonised? Or is it the people that are colonising, the colonised? And I'm wary of that. I think we should all be wary of that when the message that's going out is coming from the very mouths that come from a history that implemented those very constructs and contributed to the destruction of Te Ao Māori and our world.
That is so interesting because it's quite an irony, isn't it, when you hear the same white colonial structures now lecture Indigenous people and people of colour, ethnic people on climate change, and while at the same time devaluing their knowledge.
Not only devaluing the knowledge, but also capturing our knowledge, writing our knowledge, stealing our knowledge would be the right word in many instances, and utilising it to benefit their agenda. That's the danger we have of allowing information to go out that we don't manage, or can't manage, or haven't managed, because the misuse of that information has often come back and contributed to the continuous colonisation of Indigenous people, and Maori in particular, especially here.
So, I want to hear a little bit more about this concept of connection you keep bringing up. As a starting point, you say that we have to think about the role of the whenua, the role of Maori in leading these conversations, and at the same time thinking about how these connections can come together in the struggle to decolonize.
The statement of for Māori by Māori is predominantly being espoused out there in the wider public. You couldn't get any more clearer than that statement about if it's created by Māori, the concepts are Māori, then we will be able to overcome and bring ourselves out of the poverty, the hardship and the struggles we are facing as Indigenous people. How can anybody else determine for us through our lens what that looks like? In particular, if they have never been through the same process of colonisation. Even if you decorate it to look like it is a Māori concept and framework, it must be exercised and delivered by Māori. If we are building policy frameworks that stipulate we have a framework here that's deliverable to Indigenous people by Māori, for Māori. It's written on that paper. It's written on that document, but who's actioning it? And what are the strings attached to it? At the end of the day, when we are coming back to a construct of colonisers through the government, how much control do we really have? Only as much as they're prepared to give us. We only have to look at that through the representation of Māoridom across the whole public sector. I mean, you come from an organisation, Professor Mohan, the universities. How many Māori are representing us there? We might have in constitutions that are put into these organisations, we have the treaty principles that we apply through our constitution. How is that exercised? What does that look like? Who decides whether it's acceptable or not, or relevant in specific areas? So there have been minimal changes, but we've still got a long way to go. And in my lifetime, I would like to see a lot more done than where we are today.
You know, one of the things you talk about when discussing by Maori, for Maori, is this notion of that being transformative, right? So I suppose, you know, one of my questions is, when does that become, that concept itself gets removed from its philosophy and what it means and becomes another tick box for the institutionalized structure to perpetuate itself, vis-a-vis that concept being the basis for a paradigm shift in the institution?
Actions speak louder than words. If it's written there, that doesn't necessarily mean it's being actioned, which is why it's imperative that wherever the constitutions and constructs have the treaty principles as the founding document and recognised as the founding document for this country, that they are actually applying that, not just in theory, but in action. And that comes from the representation of who sits within these structures. What does that look like? Where do they come from? Do they have grassroots connections? Are they connected to the grassroots people that are the recipients of a lot of the decisions that are made by institutions, that are made by people that have never struggled, that don't know what it's like to have their children removed by a system, a colonial system, that's set up not by Māori, for Māori, but by a Pākehā construct that's going to be designed to manage Māori. There's a difference. In terms of the statement itself, what's good for Māori, being Indigenous, is good for you. You'll have to take my word for it. And I say that because we know how to connect with our environment. We know how our environment reacts to certain activities, and we have a spiritual connection as Indigenous people and ethnic people that I believe it would be a struggle for not all, but a large number of Pākehā to connect. It's easier to go to church on a Sunday and connect through the Bible or the book or Christianity than it is for them to connect with the spiritual realm, which Māori find more significant. We had the Christian philosophies come through here in the early 1800s. We now have it on many of our maraes. We need to decolonise. We need to start trusting back in what we know better, and that's the land. The land talks to us, we talk to the land. And that's how it should be. That's what connects us through our whakapapa to our land. If you don't have that connection, how do you know what's best for your people and best for your whenua and best for what's happening with the environment? We are the gatekeepers, we are the kaitiaki, we are the protectors, first and foremost, of the lands we live in and live on. And that should be acknowledged and respected.
You know, and you shared this earlier when we were chatting, how you look at colonization, is its role in disposition of colonized people from their land. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, the constructs that came into power when the introduction of the Westminster model came to Aotearoa had a clear strategy of dismantling what was considered to be the norm to Maori. And the way to do that was to implement certain pathways. Remove the language, remove the whenua, strip the whānau. Those are the divide and conquer strategies that I know we all relate to. I know Indigenous people relate to. I think that we need to take a long, hard look at those strategies and, because we're aware of them, start sharing the solutions for all of those groups that have been colonised on what that looks like where we're living. Because even those groups that are coming to countries that are living there, there seems to be a disconnect on the history of which they came from. And I always say to my people, when you go to other people's land, you respect the Indigenous people there. You respect how their culture is, whether I agree with it or not. We must respect the people of the land. Keep our values and keep our mana intact. And coming here, we must also, as the Indigenous people here, Maori, be open to sharing our knowledge and views with other ethnic and Indigenous groups, because they are our strongest alliance, because of our shared history and our relationships.
I find that just that last part of the conversation so inspiring, because it gives me hope in terms of how we can redo the world, maybe.
I think it's important that we continue to talk about these pathways forward, and that we don't lose sight of how decolonisation must happen. And it is a collective approach. Māori have been struggling and battling here with the Crown for placing in a country, on whenua, on land that originally came from Māori. And to often hear the validation and excuses that are applied by racists, and I will say that, that's really all they are. Excuses for validation for behaviours that they know are not acceptable, to continue to benefit only a certain few. Whereas Māori worldview is to look after everyone. It is to ensure that the land is protected and that our mana remains intact.
You know, I suppose, I see the thread how your work on anti-racism then connects with a lot of your work on land-based struggles. I would love to hear a little bit more about the work that you have done on land rights.
I did the, prior to this election coming up very shortly, I led the Te Ture Whenua reforms. And it was significant because this is what happens when the coloniser continues to colonise. Too often we are distracted as Indigenous people or Māori because there are so many different things happening at the same time. What occurs is that there are agendas that are normally driven. And in this particular case, there was not just a amendment to certain legislation, the Te Tere Whenua Bill, 1994, but it was a complete rewrite. And it was rushed through Parliament in its first reading. That's significant to Maori at that point in time because Maori were not properly consulted when it first came out. There was little or no input into the amendments that were made. Those amendments would have and could have proved to be very detrimental had the bill been allowed to go through. Now, in order for us also as Māori to progress, we needed to accept there are certain things that we need to do to ensure that our people remain in employment, that we are bringing our people out of poverty, that we are growing our communities with whoever might be living within our communities and our regions. But we must ensure we retain our rights as Māori. We must hold the government to account when there are breaches with Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And in this particular case, when that bill went forward, it breached all of those areas. And my history, having been a public servant, and come from within a structure that I know very well as an act, it raised concerns about the way in which the government was continuing to play out its agenda. And that would have been another form of alienation. Māori have only just started to keep retaining our land back. We should ensure that continues, but we must be aware of what's happening when we get distracted from other areas into other areas. And that would happen across the board for many Indigenous groups. We must keep ourselves aware. And my experience had a lot to do with ensuring that that bill didn't go through. And it was the first time in 30 years a bill was pulled off the table in Parliament.
Can you talk about that process, how you organised that?
Well, consultations, after there was opposition to the way in which the government took that approach, the first stepping stone for us, or for myself and a few others, was to go out and ensure that we were at those consultation meetings, that we ensured that we were noting that we opposed. We were opposing the changes to the Te Ture Whenua Bill, and we were at that time opposing the government's strategy. Now, you go to one meeting and they're bringing and delivering out what should have been an information meeting, not a consultation meeting. If you've heard it for the first time, it's not consultation. If you've heard it for the first time, it's information. And that's what we should be very clear about. If you're going to come out as the Crown and present to Māori, you come out with the right wording, information, not consultation. And when you ask attendees to sign your registers, then those attendees should be obligated to stand up and note that they are only here to hear an information sharing meeting, not a consultation. When it comes to consultation, then you decide whether you agree with it. But if you're agreeing with something at an information where you only just heard, those are the pitfalls that we must be aware of. Those are the pitfalls when oil companies come out to you. When people that are going to want to hear or have an agenda come into small communities and they present to you, make sure it's not consultation. Be very clear, have it noted, make sure you record it. Those are the strategies we must apply today. My thoughts are contemporarily modern day activists must be modern day strategists, Indigenous modern day strategists.
Yeah, I mean, That's really interesting because, the age-old strategies of the colonizer, which are really shrewd, manipulative, and corrupt in a sense, are the same strategies that are used now. Because in many ways, like just how you're describing that process, it seems like, I think of myself walking into a session like that, not really knowing, and then signing off the sheet thinking that it is just an attendance sheet. So I guess to keep up with that also requires a certain kind of collective intelligence.
It does. It requires that Modern technology has its benefits today because it's easier for us to Zoom hui than it actually is these days to attend it, especially if they're spread out around the country and the resources are limited. We must take advantage of some of those things and use them to our ability like we are today. Connecting and keeping your networks informed of what's happening is important. It's the key to ensuring that when you are aware of a strategy that's being deployed by governments that are going to be detrimental to Indigenous views, then we must ensure that we keep everyone connected. And that's a very important strategy that took place during that time. We went through Facebook, we put up a Facebook page, we informed everybody, we videoed everybody, we videoed the meeting, we videoed the resolutions, we videoed who was there, we took our own notes, and we were very clear that when we went to these meetings, we were passing information to all of the different groups around the country, letting them know the motions that we were going to be moving. And those motions were very clear, because once the meetings have started and then you start seeing recommendations coming up before you that have been put in place by government agents, we have to be prepared on the spot to close that down before it filters out back to governments to mandate and implement when the people have not been consulted. And be also aware that if it benefits, that might be fine, but we must still maintain that consultation and manage it. If we lose control of that, we find that that is where all the tick boxes to the agendas that are being driven are then carried out, right from those meetings. Follow it through and ensure that you've got the paperwork. It seems so tiresome and a whole lot of work for community groups or Indigenous people and Maori when the resources are limited. But the key component is having your strengths beside you and the people you surround yourself with that have the same passion, the same desire, and come from similar backgrounds. And they don't necessarily have to be Maori. They can be ethnic groups, Indigenous groups, anybody. They don't even have to be either of those. They can also be non-Maori. Because in this day and age, I'm hopeful that the relationships between myself or my people is going to be strengthened in the next generation between our uri, our survivors, and those who once were the colonisers. And that change has to start now with the way in which they're teaching in universities and delivering out. Policy-driven bureaucrats that are creating policies in head offices and ministries that have detrimental effects on Indigenous people, in particular if those bureaucrats are not Indigenous and have never had the experience at grassroots and come from a privileged background. And it doesn't matter what colour you are.
So it seems that the universities need to be decolonised.
I would suggest that they actually be the first ones to be decolonised, because a lot of what filters out of those universities is set in place in a specific structure that unless you're credited with academic accolades, your word is not as credible. The words of wisdom and knowledge from our people don't have enough pull in a non-Maori worldview and a construct like the system we live in today. And that's important to note. If we don't change the teachers, and we don't change the narratives, and we don't change what's being taught, and we don't participate and engage, it will continue to remain the same. They will continue to deliver out the same old philosophies. And sometimes those philosophies, or many times those philosophies, don't meet with Māori components or frameworks at all. And are working in opposite direction to Te Treaty o Waitangi.
So, how can you think practically that change can happen? Like, can you suggest some strategic steps?
I think one would be first, I mentioned that earlier about Māori representation, ethnic representation, colour them up. And I say colour them up because it's not just about colour, it's about the cultures and what they bring to the table. It's about the learning experiences we can work together on to grow an economy we're all going to have to live in. It's about understanding the Māori treaty principles with the Crown, our place, and understanding we are here to lead the country forward. We're not here to be led. People often refer to me, they tend to say to me, Marise, you know, you're a leader. I'm very clear that I don't consider myself a leader. My people lead me. And that's the persona I take on board. Even though I have been renowned for taking the lead on several protests, like the GCSB bill when it came out, the oil and gas industry practices with tag oil that took place up in Tūranganui, Gisborne. I was a supporter of the TPPA protest, the foreshore and seabed, and I have a really good relationship with a lot of people that have been involved in those areas. And it's a wonderful thing to become a part of and move forward, because change is about being in those paradigms and surrounding yourself with people with the same passion. And it must be a just passion. It must be benefit all. But Māori must lead in Aotearoa. We are protectors not only of our environment, but also the manuhiri and the people that come here. We are having so many discussions now about immigration, immigrants and refugees. When Captain Cook first arrived here, they were refugees. They were manuhiri. And with open arms, my people went out to greet them. And we had the killing of the tupuna wine that occurred in the arrival on the 8th of October of 1789. We need to remind ourselves we must be cautious about who we let through our doors. We must be cautious about what intent they come with. We must better inform ourselves because it's important. It's about protecting our survival in many instances and our culture. We have no excuse not to do that now. And that's a lesson we learned. We must be supportive. We must still maintain our tikanga. We must still be aroha people to our guests that come here. And my message to my people is remember who we are. Don't let the coloniser take the last thing we've got left. And that's our aroha to bring people in and awhi them, especially when they come from a system that's constructs have been built around war-torn countries. And we have a government, or governments have had governments that contributed by supporting other governments that had that responsibility and took it on board. Afghanistan is one, Syria is another. That's not who we are. And I know that's what's out there is, it's not us. A clear example of what happened with the terrorist in Christchurch. Well, it's not me. It's not my people. That's not us. Is it a renowned trait of colonisers? Of course it is. It's what's happened here with the wars. It's what's happened in Afghanistan. It's what's happened everywhere. It's not us. And I'm very clear about that.
That also, I think, is a really interesting message when you say it's not us, because that is a great segue into talking about anti-racist strategies. Because it seems like one of the strategies of racists often is that we are all the same, we are all equal, we are all together. Do you want to sort of talk about that strategy?
A strategy, it's just a validated excuse for some of the behaviours that have occurred from colonisers to reduce the amount of hurt or damage that it's doing to another Indigenous or another peoples. We're not all us. We don't all come from the same cultural background. The only thing that makes us is the fact that we're both humans. But we have a similarity in terms of the way an ethnic group deals with other groupings and they maintain their culture. There is a variance of what that looks like. What's wrong with variety? What's wrong with diversity? It's nothing as long as it doesn't encroach and disrespect. And those values are not forced on another group of people that are that group of people that connect to the land. The oneness approach, another song that continues to be sung out. Who's saying we're all one? And it's, again, I find it tends to come from that white background that validates the behaviours and ignores the considerations and recommendations that are being made by their Indigenous peoples. If it's one, they should be consulting. They should be considering what we're saying in terms of representation. Is that happening? No, it's not. Will it happen? Well, when they're genuine about this oneness. And it's not happening today. And I think that that can also be said about the statement that was made by the UK High Commissioner when she came to Tūranga and expressed regret in terms of the killing that took place in Tūranga with my tūpuna, an expression of regret. What does that mean to me? What does that mean to my people when we're living through the aftermath of colonisation and what has occurred from the arrival of the colonials here? It doesn't mean anything to me. What would be better is if they were genuine about the changes and the relationship they want to have with my people. I can't change the past, but we can change what happens tomorrow. And they've got to be willing to make a genuine change to that. However, making the continued excuse and saying, well, UK no longer has a responsibility to New Zealand, it's your government. It was Maori and the Queen of England that signed the treaty. At what stage did we sign those rights over to the subjects? And it's just another disingenuine agreement that the colonials continue to carry out, and no doubt would be carrying it out in Australia, in the US, and every other Indigenous group. They've had years of mastering that practice. And I think the easiest thing for us to do is to take on board those strategies that they're applying and start utilising our collectiveness as Indigenous and ethnic groups and colonised groups around the world to find solutions. But it must first start with the constructs that are in place and the dismantling of those constructs.
Can you, I'm going to use that segue to talk about the 250 protests. What was your main intent behind organizing those protests?
It was to raise awareness that, yes, we have come through these colonised eras of time and history, that back then we were dealing with the aftermath of colonisation, with what was happening with the New Zealand Wars, the assimilation of Maori culture, the introduction of Christianity. All of these different changes that were happening then were impacting on the survival of Māoridom. We move it forward to today. How is that colonial view still impacting on us today? And I go back to the constructs that are in place today that don't have the representation that's required to deal with a lot of the racist issues that are occurring now. And I found it, the only pathway was we were going to have the world size on us. And it was an opportunity for us to let the world know, no, this is not as grand celebration as it's been put out there by the stereotypes, the media approach on it, the controlled media in certain instances, the ability and the relationship that was being advertised around the country. We were not happy that we were going to be reminded first and foremost of the replica endeavour that brought onto our shores diseases, was responsible for the genocide of my ancestors, and also for the raping and pillaging of my people. What was there to celebrate? They had what they considered, in my view, Captain Cook, and I say it again. People keep asking me, what do you think of that? I don't think anything of him. He's not on my whakapapa. I don't care if I don't have to hear about him again. I don't want to know why or what he's done. He's irrelevant to me. The only thing that I need to know and my people need to be reminded of is that what came with the endeavour and the impacts it's had. Sure, everybody wants to celebrate navigators and explorers, and that may be what English people want to acknowledge him as a navigator and explorer. That's fine, but acknowledge what happened when they landed as well. And that's where we were very clear. When the endeavour arrived, my people went out and opened their arms and welcomed them onto our shores. And in response to that, aroha, the genocide that occurred, the raping and pillaging, the theft of land, that was the result of our aroha. And I stand by, be careful who we let in our doors, because not always there they come with a halo. In doing so, we move forward, and we are now, as recipients of the construct that came with that colonial arrival. where we're dealing with child removals, racism in police force, high unemployment, poor health stats, poor education, poverty, land theft, and corporatisation. It hasn't benefited us. And the biggest issue we are seeing that's happened as a result of that is the stripping of that whānau concept, that family concept from Māoridom, because of the constructs that have been in place, that have been entrenched in hidden legislation across the board, where it has been unfair for Māori representation to be invisible. We'll have it on a piece of paper, but whether we want it in action is another story. Mm-hmm. And that still continues today. You take the name of Child, Youth and Families that removes Māori children from their homes without consultation, and you replace it with a Māori name. It's still a duck. Still quacks like a duck. Not much has changed from it.
Right.
And it's not driven by Māori for Māori to keep our children protected. A lot of the high incarceration numbers with Māori men and women, a lot of that comes from the traumatised, generational, intergenerational abuse that's occurred, the violence that's occurred, the stripping of those family concepts, those values, those key things that Māori and Indigenous groups grow their families off are the cultural values that are being assimilated and oppressed within institutions because they only want to take a small bit of it. They don't want to take the lot. We need to keep you under our thumb. We need to manage you. There is no such thing as shared power.
You know, I study communication. I'm a student of communication, right? So to me, what is really interesting in all of this is how communication is turned on its head. Like you use the child, youth and family services example, and it is almost, from what you're saying, really dangerous when a violent entity like that, which actually perpetuates racist violence, goes out and frames itself with Maori packaging and Maori branding that makes it look nice and feel good.
I think the biggest concern is that even if you rebrand it, the internal mechanics still remain the same. The policies are still the same. The bureaucrats are still the same. The biggest concern for our people is not being able to connect the dots because of the three arms of government. And we often continue to disregard or be made aware of that. Because you appoint an MP into a position, that MP isn't necessarily going to be able to change the world. We've got to be on par with what the judicial arm is doing, what the administrative arms of government are doing, and also what our MPs are supposed to be doing. We need to be politically minded to understand how the game is played, whether we want to or not, in order to have representation across the board on the different sectors of ministries. We need to make sure we know how and what they're instructed to do. We want to know that we need to have a say on almost everything. There can't be a treaty in place that is not going to be exercised in its entirety within ministries across the board. It just will not work. And we must have Māori representation in order for change to be beneficial for the whole country, actually.
Right.
For the whole country. We need to keep connecting our dots in our relationships with our ethnic groups and our Indigenous groups. I stand by that because we need to take new approaches and new strategies and embrace new ideas.
Right. And part of that also seems like there needs to be a certain level of critical training or critical reading. Like one needs to be able to look beyond the Maori name of Child, Youth and Family Services to actually really see what is going on inside. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yes, and there needs to be, just like it's really important that there needs to be an independent voice within these organisations that's disconnected from control. And the treaty partner is that independent voice. It should be. And that treaty partner is Maori. We can't have organisations that are being questioned by the general public investigating themselves. That's ridiculous. Not when we have a treaty in place. You know, it's just, it breaches an ethos and a code of ethics. And the treaty, where is the Maori voice? It must be independent and it must be unattached to the carrot strings that are being dangled often in front of Indigenous and Maori. And they happen all the time. If you're in poverty, if you're enslaved and you're being offered a carrot and you've got children at home that are hungry, your temptations are far greater than somebody who's fully resourced. And in certain instances, you can't really blame people who are oppressed. They come from that environment. But we've got to keep reminding ourselves of who we are. It's an interesting time. And I think that we need to be very clear on how the operational functions and the mechanics of governments actually work. Because the buck stops and the buck starts there. And if we don't change what that looks like, then we will continue, as Matua Ranginui Walker said, to struggle to no end.
You know, another example of this kind of deception is the story that you narrated with 250, which is, you know, really the story of violence, genocide, murder, rape, that is replaced by an altogether different story, which is a story of progress, development, bringing in transformation, right? And then that story is used to then stigmatize Maori, right? So there are family problems, like you're saying. There are problems with drugs. There are problems with violence. So it's really interesting how this whole thing is constructed. So I guess with media that are, and with various structures of storytelling that are owned by the colonial structures, I guess the question is, how do you disrupt that fundamental story?
About the stereotypes that have gone out about
the stereotypes, but also the erasure, right? The erasure of the violence, the genocide, the murders and the rapes.
I think it's very, very important to get that independent and correct storylines that are going out there, and hold more discussions at public events, more discussions with communities we don't normally engage with, and start educating them from grassroots. Not always is the only place you can learn in an institution like universities or schools. Everything around us we learn from. The best teachers should always have been modelled parents. But when you're getting raised in a home where the father is incarcerated and has come from a background where he was a state care child, he's now perpetuated what he learned and ended up incarcerated. The mother still now has to keep the survival within her whānau home alive and well. She has to do whatever she needs to keep her children. But an absent father is prominent in terms of the stripping of the whānau. The protector is being removed. And so it leaves the mother vulnerable. And when she's vulnerable, the system takes hold of the whole whānau. How do you intercept that? We start to reconnect ourselves with our people, revive our heritage, and restore the language and utilise our land. All of those concepts are important to decolonisation. And learn to build relationships. Keep building relationships. There are some relationships we might not want, and that's okay. But the key is about building relationships with different groups, different ethnic groups. Understanding the difficulties that we might be having as Māori are not necessarily the only difficulties that are being faced by one specific group. Racism is affecting many groups. But to have somebody that is validating the behaviours of the colonials and the construct that's currently in place only allows us to strengthen our views and passion about continuing our opposition to racism. And that shall continue. Keep the fires burning.
So as we, move toward wrapping up, that's what I want to ask you, is that what is your wisdom or words of advice for anti-racist struggles in Aotearoa?
If there is one thing that I would be more inclined to say, follow Maori strategies and Maori advice in terms of how we can better manage the racism by connecting and utilising our commonalities, our strengths in terms of colonised groups, so that we will educate the future generations together for however long you plan to stay here. And protecting what is indigenous cultures of their land is very important, especially when we have a treaty here. Nobody else is on that treaty but us and the Queen. and for whatever reason, unless we can come together and recognise that, we will have problems. My message to government at this particular time, when we have pandemic and we have Māori out there that are on checkpoints protecting our people and protecting our regions, and the persona is out there, they need to be arrested, they need to be stopped, they are doing illegal checkpoints. Māori are not out there just protecting Māori, they're protecting everybody. Doesn't matter what colour, doesn't matter what race, doesn't matter what culture. News medias need to print that and stop printing organised, managed, racist headlines that continue to divide and conquer communities in order to manage Indigenous people at grassroots. And once we get past all of those issues, we will be a better country for it. So engage with Māoridom and don't wait for us necessarily to invite you to attend meetings or huis, or if you have questions, ask, so that there is a clear understanding on what is acceptable in Māoridom and what is not. It is a form of respect that I would expect when we go to another country. We respect that culture's culture, even if we don't agree with it. If we were to go to England and protest outside Buckingham Palace and tell them how they are or should be reacting or acting, I don't think we're going to be walking home. as safely. And I think that needs to be a message that's clear. Enforcing your beliefs on another culture to assimilate that culture and oppress it is a form of racism, and it must be stopped.
Thank you so much, Marise. Is there anything else that you would like to add that I haven't asked?
I think that our Maori leaders that have done the best they could, I don't always necessarily agree with them. I think that we need to drive the kaupapa of hapu and whānau and focus less on the constructs of iwi, just to satisfy the Crown, the government, because they don't want to do business with all these tribes. Let's amalgamate them. At the end of the day, we're still Maori, we're still mana whenua, and we're still whānau. And we should not forget that.
Thank you so much, Marise. It's been a pleasure having you and having this conversation. And I look forward to the next 3 days working on the paper together and listening to your talk and workshop.
Kia ora. Ngā mihi.